Welcome to Strip Coverlet. I'm Adrian Fort, and we are here for the second in a 5-part series as we chronicle our journey through the Hungry Ghost Festival by Jen Campbell. There will be a link to Jen Campbell's BookTube page and where you can get this collection in the description below. Part 2 of this series is a poem-by-poem walkthrough with my reaction to each of these poems. And if you have the collection, which hopefully you do, you can let me know just how wrong I was in these. Now, what I'm going to be doing here is not saying what the poem is about, but saying what these poems communicated to me. And the first poem in this collection is titled Kitchen. And Kitchen is about a moment that encapsulates an entire relationship. And it's very, very sneaky good. And I hope that comes across in a positive. Because you read it, and it reads very quickly, and you like it, but you don't know why. So you read it again, and you like it more, but you don't know why. It is a poem that brings us onto the body. In this poem, we get mentions of hands, thighs, backs, feet, nipples, hair, face, and eyes. This makes poetry tangible. And it's very rereadable, and I think that one of the ways in which this is sneaky good is that it is simple in what it is doing. Not to say that it is a simple poem, but it reminds me sort of a haiku. And the reason that haikus are good is because they take something so simple and communicate something separate from the poem entirely. In fact, what this poem kind of reminds me of is a haiku from Basho or Basho, I'm not sure exactly how to say it. An old pond, a frog tumbles in, the sound of water. And what that poem does is it introduces a familiar place, which is met with a bad idea, and we are left with an image of tranquility. In this poem, we are put in a familiar place, and we are introduced with the bad idea, let's not talk of death where food is prepared, and we are left with a scene of tranquility, which is stunningly simple, right? But it is not easy. The second poem in this series, Memories of Your Sister in a Full-Body Wetsuit, was a difficult poem for me, but I think that part of that is because this is like something I've never read before. And this is something that poetry is best at. Poetry is the best writing medium for this, and Jen does this extremely well with this poem, and that is, it is the transformation of a memory. It is the transformation that a memory undergoes when it transitions from fresh to reflection. What this poem does so well is comment not only on how a childhood memory often loses its innocence upon reflection, but it also often gains complexity, to the point where even the senses have changed, have transformed. In the final sentence, water shooting up my nose and the taste of anesthetic, we are left wondering which version of this speaker is so sure of the taste of anesthetic. The third, and my notes for this are sort of all over the place, so bear with me, if you will. The third poem in this is The Mountain Miners, which is a very slick poem, where the innocent mythos of children is blurred with the deceitful intentions of adults. And we get the idea that the former transitions into the latter by gradients during our life, and it does some of that movement with the similes the poem employs. But the load-bearing pillar is, again, here, the final line. There weren't any, but that wouldn't make me kiss him. So much of this poem depends upon that line, but the rest of the poem doesn't necessarily build up to that line, if that makes sense. It is not quite an M. Night Shyamalan twist. It's something much more organic than that, but that is where the poem, for me, got its definition. Crosshatch is a poem about the near inevitability of interest in sex. The speaker reflects on a girl who is rumored into prostitution, and then speaks of the societal revulsion to the idea. It's everyone else spreading these rumors and saying nasty things. But in the middle, the speaker explains the length to which he or she and others would go to try to observe these acts of the rumored running around. The speaker even wonders of these places where these acts are supposed to take place, whether or not the grass was long. And why that is so important is it says that the speaker in this poem never even had the gusto to walk up to those places his or herself. That it was just an observation. The things that were rumored to be going on there were so bad, but bad in the way that a train wreck is bad, that you can't look away from it, that you couldn't even put yourself in the bad place. The next poem, The Angel, is one of my favorite poems in the collection, and I'm not sure I can say why. Crosshatch is, Lobster Girl is, and Kitchen is. Those are all probably my three favorite poems, but I have to put Angel in that group, and I can't say why, which is frustrating for me. Is this poem about the folly of our heroes? Is it about the fact that even the strong will inevitably fall? Is it about the Sisyphean toil of our day-to-day life, even when this toiling seems to have some bit of grandeur to it? I cannot say. But this is a poem that I want to return to learn from the nuance of it as a writer, because I think that this poem has a lot of things that my writing does not. A lot of the minutiae that go on in this poem. The next poem, titled Birdhouse, as its opening line insinuates, and its opening line is, "One of those Sunday afternoons no one knows how to use," speaks to me about the confusion of life in which we're told there is a supposed to. You were supposed to. You were supposed to be. You were supposed to do. You were supposed to have. But we do not always feel the supposed to inherent to the situation. Angel Metal, which is the next poem, is a poem about how modernization always feels apocalyptic and always feels like a loss of innocence, despite what was going on in the past. And the fact that, sure, there are times where we might lapse into something that is less desirable than where we were, but for the most part, we move forward, not side to side, if that makes any sense. The next poem, written in my 1999 diary, Newcastle's Future, seems to be about the essence of the word indigenous. Even as the title states the past and suggests the future, and all of the people in the poem are damned to a future which is very predictable, there is one exception. That exception is the person who escaped by drastic means. But it seems to me that even this person who escaped by drastic means did so because the future was so indelibly tangible. That the inevitability of the future forced those actions. Which further explains why everyone who is there is tied to there. Because there's only one exit. The next poem, When We Found the Tide, seems to be a concession to the fact that we are where we are, though we are not trapped. But mobility is not as immediate as one might hope. And there's other people there. So while you're semi-trapped and wherever you're at, you may as well give those other people a go. Which was a very, for me it was a very unique read. I don't know that I've read anything quite like this poem, and it's hard for me to speak about any of the poems in this piece without using the terms immediate and the terms intimate, because those are both things that Jen is very good with communicating, with describing, and with putting you in that place. The next poem, Gambit, again, with the word intimate, this destroys the mass media idea of intimacy with the fact that most victories are very, very small, and most intimacies are as well. And in between there will be a whole lot of awkward. The next poem, Polyphemus, is a poem that I don't understand. And I don't think that's a bad thing, because you hand anyone 20 poems from anywhere, from anyone, through any time, and there will be one that they just don't get, that they don't understand, that they don't know how to read. And for me, this was a poem I wasn't quite sure I was reading correctly, so I don't necessarily feel comfortable commenting on. The next poem, Like a Fish Out, may be the story of an unreliable narrator. The title suggests need, right? A fish out of water needs water. But the final two sentences of the poem, so you have no need at all, suggest something very different. And the intervening story seems to tell of a pair who can't get in where they fit in. And that story is like the literary trope, a fish out of water story. But a fish out of water is the story of a fish who needs water. So there's a lot more going on here, and I am guessing that I'm leaving something major out of that little description. Lily Rose says a lot about the inner world being much, much bigger than the outer world. Springtime Catch seems to be about finding, if not hunting, little innocent moments to live within, like an immeret. Treading Water. Again, I'm all over the place here, so. Is another example, Treading Water is another example of the intimacy of immediacy. A lot of these poems, and especially this one, seem to cry out for touch, which is a neat trick for a writer to pull off, and pull off very well. When you start going on to the senses, it is difficult to make the leap from explaining a sensation to making the reader yearn for or even feel that sensation. And making your reader yearn for that feeling is something that Treading Water pulls off. The Art of Saving Other People is a very grounded poem, and I hope this doesn't sound derogatory, but I think this example will communicate. You know those dreams where you fall asleep, but you fall asleep when you have to pee? And everything in your dream is very real and very grounded, but it contains within it this sort of frenetic energy that transforms itself into a sort of malaise and confusion. That's how this poem feels. And I realize now that I will never, ever, ever be asked to do a blurb for one of Jen's collections, and that makes me sad. The next poem, Ullambana, Ullambana, is the yin to this collection's yang. As much intimacy as there is here, like I described earlier, there's a lot of intimacy where you feel the immediacy, you feel the touch of other people. Ullambana is dripping with longing, and it sweats with the great without. It communicates something very opposite from a lot of these poems, in which you are left with a yearning, you're left with a great without. Whereas many of these poems, like I said, conduct themselves in the business of intimacy. The next poem, Lobster Girl, is about finding belonging through otherness, which is a theme that is communicated en masse in literature, especially because most writers are in some way the other. Writers, I defy you to find some writer who is the popular guy, the guy who everybody loves all the time and who loves himself, right? that is very, there's not any example that I know of. Hemingway was the popular guy. He ended up committing suicide, right? So there's a disconnect there. Lobster Girl communicates this otherness in a way that is comparable to like Leonardo's anatomy drawings, right? There is a scientific precision there, but there is an asymmetric beauty that you cannot look away from. And I think that's the best way that I can think of to communicate exactly what that poem accomplishes. The next poem is What Happens When I Go Home. And the thing that stands out to me about What Happens When I Go Home is that it is, in a collection about intimacy, it is a poem about home, but it feels very, very distant. Which is something that, if you told me that the penultimate poem in here would be about home, I would imagine that it would be very grounded and very, this is where I belong. But this entire poem feels very distant, and here we are in the heart of the home, but we are thinking about some you in some other place, which is sort of strikingly anti-mindful, right? Mindfulness is being where you are right now, being in the moment. And this poem communicates something very, very different than that. The final poem, The Patron Saints of Animals, is a poem about value. What do you value and how do you express it? And we are thrust into this immediately by the fact that the title contrasts so heavily, so immediately with that first line. So you're left as a reader with this experience. The patron saint of animals. No one mentions the dead bird hanging in the hall. That is a great leap to make, because when you hear the patron saint of animals, you're not immediately thinking about martyrdom, right? You're not immediately thinking about death, despite the fact that death is what one has to go through to become a saint. And that is the entire score of poems as we go through a 5-part series on Jen Campbell's The Hungry Ghost Festival. If you like this sort of thing, hit like and subscribe, and hopefully you can tell me how you feel and what you took from some of these poems from Jen's collection.